I wanted to sort of pull back from the particulars that my colleagues have addressed and make the case that there is a fundamental incompatibility with the very system since World War II of asylum, with the reality that there is no practical limit to the number of people who could qualify for asylum, even under more narrow definitions, and who want to live in more prosperous, orderly, stable countries. And ultimately, my contention is that it's necessary, the only way to get a handle on this is to end asylum as it currently exists. Now, this is just me saying it. The members of our network are not responsible for what anybody else says, so don't hold this against anyone else. This is just me, but I just don't think that there's ultimately any conclusion other than that. Now, I'm not going to go back to 511 AD as much as a fan I am of antiquity, but we started with, we are here because of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which was a post-World War II, beginning of the Cold War measure, related only to Europe, only to people who had already been displaced by the Red Army takeover of Eastern Europe. And as Nicholas said, in 1967, the protocol relating to the status of refugees applied those same rules to the whole world and applied them prospectively for anybody in the future. And that set the stage for what we are dealing with. And asylum, as it's laid out in the UN treaties, represents a surrender of sovereignty by nation states. It's a pledge to let foreigners decide who's going to live in your country instead of you. It reframes immigration as a right rather than a privilege. And that is, in a sense, the core of the problem here. Now, for the first 4 decades of the post-World War II asylum regime, it was a non-issue. It's only a little bit of an exaggeration to say that it really only applied to a few Russian ballerinas and people who were able to fly balloons over the Berlin Wall. It was a small enough issue that surrender of sovereignty that it represented wasn't salient. But with the end of the Cold War, that's changed. Not just the end of the Cold War, but combined with the massive population growth in the Third World, the dramatic drop in the costs of transportation and communications, and frankly, the post-1960s loss of cultural self-confidence of the leadership classes in much of the developed world have all combined to make asylum and the limits on it that are in the Refugee Convention, because it's not a blank check, there are limits on who this applies to, has made all of that essentially meaningless. The president of Finland made a point that Nicholas made when he was visiting Poland late last year, and both Poland and Finland are dealing with refugee issues instrumentalized, as Victor puts it, by Russia and Belarus to bring Middle Eastern illegal, well, they're not illegal, they let them in, but they let them in on condition that they try to sneak across the border and become the EU's problem, as sort of using them as a weapon against the EU. The president of Finland said, deportation of migrants who don't meet the criteria for asylum has become impossible. So entering the border means you stay in that country if you want to. And that's the situation that not just Europe, but the United States and Australia and Israel and even Mexico now are dealing with. And the reason for this is because asylum has become a kind of right, and incorporating that into domestic law means that attempts to deport illegal immigrants who then claim asylum will be bogged down in courts for years, as lawyers and activists and judges endlessly debate how many particular social groups dance on the head of a pin. This judicialization of immigration policy means that the asylum system as it exists has to end. As a 1980s film put it, or to reframe the quote, the only way to win is not to play the game. Asylum by law needs to be unavailable to people who cross countries' border illegally. And not just asylum, because for those of you who follow this, you know that asylum is just one of the ways that someone claiming persecution can stay here. There's something called protection under the Convention Against Torture, which, like many of these broad international agreements, is comically includes among its signatories places like China and Pakistan, where they obviously are not particularly concerned about it. And even there's something called statutory withholding, which is a measure that is entirely on us and not based on international law. But the existence of these avenues within the law that enable illegal immigrants to essentially kind of force themselves on us mean that changing the law is going to require withdrawing from the Refugee Convention and the protocol, and then developing the political will first to do that and then to change the national law. In a sense, all of the countries grappling with this asylum issue are going through something comparable to the stages of grief. There's this concept of there are different steps in dealing with grief, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. And we are at the beginning of this process of going through the stages of grief, if you will, to deal with or to acknowledge the fact that the post-World War II asylum system is dead, in a sense. It's not sustainable. Now, different people in different countries are at different stages where, denial, anger, and bargaining is where various countries and various people are. And part of that, if you will, the bargaining stage of grief is a lot of the things that we are talking about here on Capitol Hill as well as in Europe. Things like remain in Mexico, which is an essential and very useful reform put in place by the Trump administration. Other things that Eric had gone into about the various provisions in H.R. 2, the raising the bar for credible fear, which is the initial screening interview to see whether you might be eligible for asylum, the safe third country agreements that Victor talked about. All of these things are useful, in a sense, half measures. And I don't mean this in any way to denigrate them, but they are sort of the bargaining stage of grief, trying to come up with a way to keep the post-World War II asylum regime, but make it workable. And ultimately, I don't think that's possible. They will always, a lot of them, first of all, will be administrative changes, can always be reversed by subsequent administrations. And ultimately, we need to change the whole approach we have to asylum and essentially jettison it. And so what I would suggest is the way we are eventually, when we get to the stage of acceptance, illegal immigrants are simply going to be barred from asylum. Asylum essentially won't exist. But on its own, that doesn't solve the problem, because there will always be people who will immigrate illegally and who maybe, even if they don't make an asylum claim, we either don't want to or can't send back. There are countries that won't accept deportees. There will be people always who come who really we don't want to send back, who will be, potentially tortured. And so we need to combine both an end to the asylum regime, but adopt one of the approaches sort of in the bargaining stage of grief, if you will, which I call remain in Rwanda, to sort of build on the remain in Mexico idea. And I didn't just pick Rwanda. I mean, obviously, it's been referred to here before, but Denmark and Britain followed Israel's lead in coming up with an agreement with Rwanda to send illegal alien asylum seekers to Rwanda, not like the remain in Mexico approach, where you still get to apply in the U.S., you just have to wait in Mexico. The point of, again, what I call remain in Rwanda is that you don't even get to apply in the state that you infiltrated illegally. You get to apply in Rwanda or anywhere else you want to, but that's where we're going to send you. It's been stopped or discontinued by judicial opposition, by legal fiat. Both in Israel, they actually ran it for a number of years until the Supreme Court stopped it. In Britain and Denmark, it hasn't even gone through, although the British Prime Minister has said he's going to go through with it anyway, regardless of what their Supreme Court said. We'll see how that works out. Both of them were inspired by Australia's Pacific solution, where they said anyone who comes, any boat people who come there, and this is dealing with the issue of sea borders rather than land borders, even if they're drowning, they're picked out of the ocean or what have you, but they're never allowed to enter Australia. They were sent to offshore island holding facilities from which they could then apply for asylum anywhere else if they wanted to. And so just to sort of, I want to have time for questions, but in a sense what I'm envisioning is for the United States anyway, remain in Rwanda for people who are from Africa, but you'd need remain in, say, Paraguay for people from Latin America, and then remain in Mongolia for people from Asia. The point is, it's ending asylum doesn't mean we just sort of erase something and the problem goes away. People are mobile. There are going to be people we don't want to or cannot send home. So it's going to require active diplomacy, and it's going to cost a lot of money and, bribes and what have you, in order to develop and constantly renew and refresh a network of countries that we can send people to who illegally come into our country. And frankly, once that's going, the number of people trying it is going to be small, because why bother to spend all of that money, take all of the risk involved to, fly from Tajikistan to Istanbul to Dakar to Quito in Ecuador, and then walk or take a bus all 2,000 miles up to the U.S. border when you're just going to end up in Mongolia anyway. So the point is not that these countries are going to be coping with the massive numbers of people as we are, but rather that by removing the incentive, we clamp down on the phenomenon altogether.